Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Yoli Aguilar Candelario, and I am a Dean Student Ambassador at the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. I will be serving as the MC for today's webinar with our student spotlight speaker, first-year Master Public Policy candidate, Kristelda Terporden. This webinar is brought to you by the UCR School of Public Policy and the Dean's Brands Ambassadors. My peers and I are delighted to host this event and provide this service for the general community. Before we get started, I want to go over the format for today's webinar. We will devote the first half hour of today's event to a presentation by our guest speaker. We will then reserve the last half hour of today's event for an audience Q&A. For that Q&A, I have also invited a few of my public policy classmates to ask questions on camera directly to our guest. Audience members, if you have any questions you would like me to pose during our Q&A session, please do not send them via chat, but instead send them using the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screens. You can submit your questions anytime throughout the event via the Q&A feature. You do not have to wait until the audience Q&A portion of today's event to send in your questions. Now, at this point in time, it is my honor to introduce our guest speaker, Kristelda Terporden. As a non-traditional student, Kristelda knows the challenges coming and living in disadvantaged communities. Raised in a system-impacted home, she overcame those barriers and hopes to bring her lived and work experiences to public policy. Her goal is to create inclusive and holistic public policies for the re-entry population. Kristelda, can I just say how delighted we are to have you with us today?
Thank you so much. Very excited.
Of course. I will now hand it over to you for your presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Yoli, for introducing me, and thank you for UCR School of Public Policy to allow a space for students to really hone in on their talents and their passions, and of course, public policy. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and dive in and start my presentation. So I'm going to talk about the challenges amongst the reentry population, specifically employment and housing. I wanted to actually start about my journey. So here's my story. I'd like to talk about the background of the journey on my way to presenting reentry population. As Yoli mentioned, I'm a system-impacted person, meaning that both my parents were incarcerated, including some of my family members. And in a sense, I had no idea it was actually going to set up my future, but I would know in due time. So I'm not a traditional student in the sense that I graduated from high school and came straight to college or university. I did not start my educational journey until I was 25 when I got my GED. I then started Norco College at 30 years old, and then I went to get my undergrad at Cal State San Bernardino, and here I am now working on my master's in public policy. So school was a new adventure for me because I was the first to attend college. I had no idea what I was in store for. I had no social support, no academic sponsor, nothing like that, right? And so I was not raised with a civic engagement, a civic culture, but I began volunteering my first political campaign in 2016 because I wanted change. I then met someone at one of those events, and he invited me to an organization called All of Us or None. All of Us or None is a nationwide grassroots organization fighting for the rights of formerly and currently incarcerated people and their families. At my first Riverside All of Us or None meeting, I was listening to everybody introduce themselves and their background. I began to hear stories that I could relate to and was shocked to even hear as well. I would hear family members say that their incarcerated loved ones were wrongfully convicted. The hardship that it had on the family with visiting their loved ones hours away, getting a hotel, accepting phone calls, sending resources to their loved ones. I then also heard family members talk about their loved ones' health decline, whether it was physical health, mental health, either way they were experiencing those kinds of adversities. I would even hear shocking stories, as a mother once shared that as her daughter was released at nighttime, which is typically at midnight, they end up finding her miles away, murdered. And so these all kind of, like I said, resonated with me. I then would hear actually the effects of incarcerated folks. So I would hear things like, I was in solitary confinement for months, and then I was really straight to the public. I heard I had health issues, but I had no access to my medication or services. I would hear stories like, I was in prison for 20 years. I worked nearly every single day, but I didn't get a dime for it. And I just got the $200 that they gave me at the gate. I would also hear, I worked really, really hard to get my GED and associates, and now I want to be a lawyer. However, I am barred from that because of my previous conviction. So when I would hear these types of reasons, again, that's when I knew that I was where I had to be, right? So after months of volunteering, whether it was fundraising, just showing up to events and helping out, I actually end up getting a job offer from a local reentry organization in Riverside County. They are a member of All of Us or None, and starting over really gave me the opportunity, and I'm grateful that they gave me a chance to invest in me. So because I had no experience, I did community organizing, but I knew that I can actually bring my skills to communicate with people, bring my lived experience, be vulnerable, and talk to the community. And that just took me a long ways, right? So for example, I actually did a survey in Jurupa Valley, and I surveyed and interviewed the homeless there. I was actually recruiting the unhoused Jurupa Valley residents to assist me. And we did an excellent job, but I think most importantly, because I recruited trusting messengers. We then focused on unhoused residents, and common themes that I would hear is, I've never been homeless before, but I accidentally had a personal injury or a family in the death in the family, or a job loss or a divorce, and here I am now. I would also hear that I have no social support, I had a felon, and here I am, right? Another common theme I heard is I can't find stable employment while being homeless. So we then actually transitioned to hearing what housed residents were saying about their community, right? So I started knocking on doors here in West Riverside County, and often we would hear in the survey is, my family have lived here for decades, but I'm not sure that we can afford to live here anymore, right? We would hear that we're new to the Inland Empire, we're not sure what's going on, and we're not quite engaged yet. We also heard that I don't have time to follow the local politics because I'm working several jobs and taking care of my family. Of course, we also heard that there was a language barrier and they just could not really get involved with politics. So after a year of collecting data, we would reach out to local cities and share that survey information, share our lived experience. However, unfortunately, we didn't get the political will. But what we did, and what we always tend to do, is do things on our own. So I'm happy to announce that I spearheaded City of Corona's very first resource fair. I brought nearly 40 resources to specifically where our unhoused neighbors are at, where they're living at. We brought them there, right? We got to meet them where they're at. We did the same thing with City of Jurupa Valley. So I was really excited that all our vendors and the relationship that we created, they showed up. And that was a beautiful thing because we had both the unhoused and homeless advocates help out, right? So it was a grassroots effort. So at All of Us or None, they really focus on civic literacy. That's something, again, as I mentioned, that my culture and a lot of folks have never really engaged in. They empowered us to use our lived experience, and what we call peer support specialists is to make the change. And that's what I plan to do, is bring my lived and work experience to policy. I became a reentry manager, a reentry case manager right before the pandemic. And I thought I experienced institutional barriers before. However, the pandemic really taught us a lot of lessons. I case manage a sober living and a housing first house. And at the sober living, it was very straightforward, right? So your sobriety is your way of paying rent. What I would do is reach out to every guest and find out their immediate and long-term needs. Often it was getting basic things like food, clothing, and personal documents, followed by signing up for healthcare, social services, getting to a doctor, and getting transportation to appointments and to meet those social services interviews. 100% of my participants had no health insurance, no doctors, no dentists. They haven't seen any of these for years, right? So nearly all had poor coping skills, which comes with poor mental health. And trauma such as childhood trauma, generational trauma, and institutional trauma really can shape your behavior, right? Which leads to reverting back to what they know best, is masking with drugs, alcohol, gambling, sex, or even work. I also case manage the harm reduction house. And basically what that meant is the guests can come as they are, whether they are intoxicated, whether they are off medication, whether on probation or parole, literally just coming straight off the streets, because the concept was we're going to house you first, and then we're going to wrap around services to really get you where you need. That looked like case management, peer support specialists, employment specialist, and really, again, any volunteer and civic engagement, because we know that in order to get them up and going, we really need to get them involved with using their lived experience. So what I've learned is through the intake, which we really crafted as a qualitative approach and getting to know them from head to toe and from internal to external needs. But we learned that it was a tricky process for the social service forms. If social service actually knew that they were in a shelter, we learned that they were not getting the full support that they actually needed, because they kind of assumed that the shelter was going to actually meet their needs, but that's not always the case. And so those were some barriers that we learned. Another barrier that we learned is like food pantries, right? They expect to have an ID. However, these folks don't have an ID. They don't have money to get an ID. They don't have transportation to get an ID. And oftentimes they may not even have a birth certificate to prove to the DMV to get an ID, right? So those are kind of things that we really addressed. And it was so important, especially for people who are off their medication. We had to really address that need immediately, because we have no idea how long they haven't been on the medication. And sometimes when you're homeless, you do experience psychosis, temporary psychosis. You may not be diagnosed as with a mental disorder, but you're having these temporary psychosis because of the trauma that homelessness brings you. So much key finding that we realized was they needed a social support, they lacked coping skills, and more importantly, stable housing was key, right? So this brings me to today's topics, the challenges amongst the reentry population, but specifically employment and housing. So let's start. Now, I wanted to start with 8 million, 1 in 5 Californians are still living with old conviction. And this is a recent data from 2018 by Californians with Safety and Justice. The data here is actually nationwide. So 46% of formerly incarcerated people have difficulty finding jobs, while 45% struggle to pay fines and fees that they still have after incarceration. 40% of formerly incarcerated have health issues, including difficult sleeping. 35% difficult obtaining occupational licensing, because that's one of the collateral consequences, and 24% difficult finding housing. The negative impacts of felony conviction disproportionately impact people of color. They are overrepresented, and people living in urban areas. People without college degrees and people with low income, right? So they have the largest disparities related to finding job or housing. As we mentioned, people of color, 25% experience more difficulties versus their white peers. And so let's dive in regards to employment. So employment data for formerly incarcerated folks. 75% of informally incarcerated people are still unemployed after 1 year of incarceration. The unemployment rate for formerly incarcerated people pre-pandemic was 27%. That is super high. The depression was 25%. And here we are at 27 pre-pandemic. Unfortunately, as we see now, and according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 67% is the current unemployment rate for formerly incarcerated people. What studies have shown is justice impacted people on average do have a 3.4 jobs throughout their 4-year study period, which suggests that they were landing jobs, but they didn't offer security and upward mobility. And so let's find out some of the additional barriers. So what I'm going to talk about when I say barriers for reentry population is really, again, based off of my lived experience as a system impacted person, of what I saw my parents and family members go through, and also as a case manager with my work experience. So not only do I agree, but studies suggest that unfortunately, according to Prison Policy Initiative, formerly incarcerated people of color and women face the worst labor market and disadvantage, despite being more actively working or looking for work. Also, age. I saw a lot of folks who were victimized by the 3-strike law in the 90s re-entering, and at this point, they were in their 50s. And they lacked a lot of things, skills, social skills, including having health issues, and we'll talk about that in a second. I also noticed that we had barriers of background check, right? So explaining their gap in employment. Why was there a 5-year gap, a 20-year gap? That was something that we really emphasized in our nonprofit, our reentry nonprofit, is to really teach folks how to not only do an interview, but talk about the elephant in the room, right? And so we had to kind of basically say, sell yourself, right? Use your natural abilities, your skill sets, and sell that, but also to confront and talk about that phase in your life that you are no longer in, right? And so although the employers express willingness to hire people with past convictions, evidence does show that having a record reduces employers' callback rates by 50%. And from my experience, I felt like it was more. And so the thing is too, with formerly incarcerated people, is they have the lowest turnover rate. They are so committed because they know they have very little chance to getting another job. So they stick with it. They go above and beyond, and they really show to the employers that they're there to turn out. And second chance employers will confirm that, that's for sure. Another barrier that we saw was a lack of skills. As I mentioned, we have people who are older adults transitioning back into society. And unfortunately, they lack a lot of skills. I've seen folks who had no idea how to use a cell phone, let alone get on a Zoom, substance abuse meeting. We saw people who had no idea how to use a computer, let alone create their resume, right? So, and people who hadn't driven for decades. So that was a really, really big pertinent things that we noticed is the lack of skills. Now, as far as transportation, obviously, as I mentioned, they had lacked those skills, including transportation. But more specifically, the lack of public transportation really made it difficult. In our reentry population, our transitional houses are throughout Riverside County and LA. And we like to have houses that are in beautiful homes, right? Beautiful neighborhoods that you wouldn't even know there was a reentry shelter. However, it's difficult to find the public transportation where people can actually walk there, or let's say these people with disabilities to walk to a bus stop to then eventually get to probation or parole or a job interview. We would get social support with bus tickets. However, single use, meaning just to get there, was being given. And so I'm really emphasizing that we have like 1-day use bus passes, right? Because we need them to get there, to get back, to go to an interview, the doctors, the DMV. We need a whole day of work. Another barrier that we saw is health. And as I mentioned, These folks are aging, and unfortunately, they are also more chronically ill than the average. So they most likely than the general public have chronic diseases or infectious diseases. Older adults who are reentering have bad health, but are still full of life, and they still have a chance to thrive, right? And so they need time to recoup. They need time to recoup, get physically, mentally, and emotionally stable. So that's why I really emphasize the health barriers that they experience. Another is social support. Encouragement, assistance, filling out applications online, filling out their resume, transportation, perhaps an academic sponsor for higher education, or even entrepreneurship opportunities. I would always say to my participants, I am your social support. Use me as your emergency. Use me as your transportation or your academic sponsor, because I have that experience and I know how to navigate through it. So that's what's really great about kind of getting this opportunity, is to address these kinds of barriers. Now let's transition to housing. So housing data for formerly incarcerated people, it shows that they're 27 times more likely to be housing insecure, followed by 10 times more likely to be homeless. Unfortunately, a study states that 40% of nationwide homeless are formerly incarcerated. I'd say it probably a little higher in certain areas, but nationwide, that would probably make sense. So let's dive into what some of these numbers mean. So as far as housing barriers, again, this is coming from my lived experience, from my work experience, and I'm happy to share that. So as we mentioned before, lack of steady income, right? We see that studies show that they're looking for work, they're gaining employment, but they're not getting the upward mobility that they need, right? To save that money and to transition on. Living wages. Oftentimes when I'm talking about these barriers, I feel like I'm talking to not only formerly incarcerated, but the working poor or low income. These folks also experience these same barriers, but living wages are so important. And even just getting a $20 hour job is still not going to cut it in Southern California. But to get that living wage job and then create that stability, so challenging for the formerly incarcerated. Another is a background check. So we mentioned the elephant in the room and how you're going to address that with the employer. Well, you're going to have to pretty much do the same thing if you're formerly incarcerated looking for housing. And this is mainly for renters, right? So throughout the throughout the country, we've seen de facto housing discrimination policies called crime-free housing. This is basically a partnership with law enforcement and landlords. It allows police officers to decide, A, whether a potential tenant's criminal history disqualifies them from renting, or B, whether a tenant must be evicted because of an alleged criminal activity. Unfortunately, there is no data stating that crime-free housing policies actually do add value to quality of life. I've been really focusing on this policy and I cannot find any data. So I really just want to emphasize that we should eliminate and prohibit those kind of de facto policies that cannot back up, right? So especially we should not let law enforcement into private matters to continue segregation housing. Enough is enough. Now, another barrier that we see is affordable housing. In California, we have a major housing crisis. We have a housing shortage, a housing desert here, right? And so there are formerly incarcerated people already struggling to find affordable housing, or housing in particular, but affordable housing. As a case manager, I addressed all their immediate needs. I got them to get their personal documents. I've got them to get social services, get healthcare, get the doctor, sort out their social security or employment. I mean, we went the whole 9 yards. However, at the end of the day, that's where we really struggled with the boundaries, which is permanent supportive housing. We cannot transition them back into society from our program because there was no affordable housing or housing available. So we really need to create systems and create spaces and opportunities to, for example, a housing trust or a land trust. This gives the BIPOC communities opportunity to build generational wealth. We need to rapidly and quickly focus on housing for not only meeting everybody's needs, but extremely low income, very low income, and low income. This experience has really helped me to shift into looking at more housing policies, and I'm excited to do that for Californians. Now, number 5. Poor or no credit scores. This was actually an ongoing, reoccurring issue that I saw because they were incapacitated from society for decades. They have no credit score, right? So we had to learn how to build that credit score. Let's get ourselves a little prepaid card, build that score, because folks are still looking at a credit score as a deterrent, whether they are going to be trusty and worthy to invest in. We also saw that oftentimes they have poor credit, and people in poverty are making a choice between a hard place and an even harder one when it comes to limited budget, especially. So they would think like, okay, do I pay my light bill or do I pay gas to go to work? Sometimes they say, do I use my credit card to buy groceries, right? And thank goodness for local nonprofits that actually help to repair free credit repair, because lenders still, as I mentioned, use credit scores to determining factors. So lastly, types of past convictions. I've heard this both in my participants at the Reentry housing, but also in community events, community meetings. They would state that type of past convictions can really either make you or break you even more so. So we just talked about all the barriers for people just in general formerly incarcerated, but imagine if you had a conviction that you were manufacturing drugs, or that you were a sex offender, or perhaps aggravated assault. They have the hardest time finding housing. But yeah, we got to house these people, right? We need to create productive citizens into the community. So unfortunately, what we're seeing that taxes are being used to fight rather than to solve these types of homelessness. And so I would like to talk about policies now that some have been enacted throughout the country, some in California, but I really implore that we create this nationwide, right? So policies, restorative justice. Yes, it works. Restorative justice says, study says 85% of victim satisfaction and 15% of reoffending occurrences. Basically, what it does is repairs harm caused by crime through reconciliation. By bringing both the victim and bringing the offender and a mediator to talk it out. Oftentimes, people are a victim of a crime. In fact, 50% of people who experience victim of crime have never reported that. So we have people who are angry and hurt in society. But this is actually a beautiful program because it teaches coping skills. It teaches emotional intelligence. It shows the offender that, yes, you created harm because of a circumstance or because an isolated situation or because you inherited a situation or wrong place or wrong time. And this gives them the opportunity actually to figure out how to give back to society, and amending those relationships is powerful. So I suggest that we really adopt more restorative justice, plus it's cheaper. Okay, prison work, automatic expungement. This is a game changer, right? Automatic expungement. If we had automatic expungement that they would actually, once they left jail or prison, we wouldn't worry about the elephant in the room of housing and of employment. We would see that people can just get into society, get that job, no questions, no barriers, nothing like that. This is super needed. And goodness, if we have any policymakers in the house or watching this video, please, we implore you to really take action with automatic expungement. Also, prison work wages. We have currently inmates making less than $1 for a full days of work. if we actually help save the money and pay them, a lifer who's about 15 years or 20 years, they could essentially leave with like $30,000, right? Thousands of dollars. And this would actually leave them enough money for immediate needs like food, clothing, housing, and maybe transportation. Shoot, if we're lucky, perhaps childcare, healthcare, and paying any additional dues and fees. Also, another policy I really implore is canceling cash bail. California recently canceled cash bail. Basically, what this means is people are poor and they're too poor to bail out of jail. And we have 600,000 people currently in jails throughout the US. 70%, y'all, are there because they're too poor to bail out. What ends up happening? They lose their job. They lose their housing. They lose their children. They lose everything because they were too poor to pay. And let me give you an example. A homeless person stealing $7 in a bottle of cologne has a bail amount of $345,000. You think they're going to pay that? No. That's just causing too much folks that are incarcerated and paying too much of our taxes housing them. Also, inclusive housing. As I mentioned earlier, the de facto policies that we see, the ongoing segregated housing policies, they are creating homelessness. They are creating more crime. They're creating recidivism. We have to prohibit those type of segregating housing policies and include inclusive housing. Everybody needs to be housed. It's a human right. Stable housing creates stable people, healthy people, thriving people. And then lastly, fund reentry organizations. Yes, as people with lived experience, we are subject matter experts. And what reentry models have learned, excuse me, is implementing programs, services, and any tools that helps with a hand up, not a hand out. And at the local level, reentry populations that are working, providing sober living, housing first models to meet everybody's needs. Sometimes someone would start, for example, in our housing first, meaning come as you are, intoxicated, off medication. And the beautiful thing is they would transition to our sober living and then eventually transition back into society. So these are models that work, hence why I say evidence-based models. We also utilize the strength-based model. I mentioned earlier is we discover what their strengths are, not their shortcomings. We're not there to condemn, to bring up the past. That's their own journey. We're there to really uplift them and think about the moment and the future. And so those kinds of evidence models really work. Now, in closing, I want to say accessing gainful employment and stable housing is strongly correlated with reduced to likelihood of recidivism. Californians with convictions face over 4,800 laws that impose harmful collateral consequences that are long-term, and it does not help them at all. So as a result, many particular individuals reentering after incarceration experience homelessness. And living on the streets brings its own dangers, right? Which can make it difficult to remain unhoused. And it is just so easy to be homeless. It doesn't take very much to get homeless, as I've shared before. So I want to share my last screen with you all. Currently, it costs taxpayers $31,065 to house one unhoused person per year. Well, if we actually supported these reentry populations, it would be $10,051 to help support them, to come as they are, to give them that wraparound services. So therefore, I really implore that we invest in our community. And I couldn't really do the work that I'm doing or be inspired by organizations that really embraced me. Of course, I mentioned Riverside, All of Us or None, but All of Us or None is a nationwide, really bringing formerly incarcerated and their loved ones and their allies together. What have we done as well? At UCR, we have underground scholars. You can see about a dozen folks here. These are all system impacted or formerly incarcerated students getting their undergrad or grad or even PhD, right? So how beautiful is that? And again, really investing in nonprofits such as Starting Over, an organization that's Time Done, and Cal State Project Rebound. These are all really fostering support systems. And what we've seen, unfortunately, in the past is people are not willing to invest in us because of whether racial threat or culture threat. They're unfamiliar with our stories. And so we have to really come out and turn up for each other and really foster that. So I think it's a beautiful thing that we're investing in each other and giving each other opportunity and really uplifting and encouraging. So I want to thank you all for the time that you've given me to share about my experience, my lived and my work experience in the reentry.
Thank you so much, Creiselda, for sharing valuable information and for giving us all an insightful presentation on the employment and housing challenges the reentry population face. Yeah. At this time, we are going to go ahead and transition to our Q&A. As a quick reminder to our audience, please submit your questions via the Q&A box instead of the chat function, and I will present the questions to our guest. Additionally, I would like to introduce my fellow classmates who are now joining me on camera: Joanna Arias, Utman Alawi, Rayan Kalam, Kevin Karami, and Claudia Nunn. They will join me in posing questions directly to Creiselda throughout the next 30 minutes. The first question, we actually do have a question from an audience member, so we'll save our questions from our fellow ambassadors. But the first question will be from our audience member, Catherine Wren, who asks, are those of the re-entering population exempt from receiving Medicaid or Medicare?
They are not. They are not exempt. Unfortunately, we do see folks like undocumented residents who are, but for the most part, they do have access to Medi-Cal and then eventually Medicaid. Yes, thank goodness.
Perfect. Thank you for providing that clarification.
Yes.
So next, we do have a question from my fellow ambassador, Utman.
Yeah, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. It was super insightful to hear your own personal experiences actually working with the community on these issues. And I think that it's really insightful to have that compared to people who kind of speak about these issues from more of an outsider perspective. So I'm sure I can speak for the rest of the audience that we're all really appreciative of that. And so my question kind of relates to some of the actions that you took. You mentioned at the beginning of the job fair, beginning of your presentation, how you organized the job fair and you're going into the communities to set that up. So I was just wondering, how did the process work to actually recruiting people in businesses or other companies to actually attend that job fair? How did you go about organizing it, getting people to show up, having the actual space to host it? And if you could just like briefly summarize how that whole process worked for you.
For sure. So as we know, employment is super vital. So a lot of nonprofits that offer reentry services will always have an employment kind of sector there, right? And so we work very hard to reach out to businesses, again, knocking on doors, networking, working partnerships with workforce development to really bring in second chance employers. But just as important to actually go to the community, the business community, and introduce ourselves and our barriers and our struggles, right? So they have a better idea to humanize it. What we also did, though, was reach out to local partners to say, you've got a space, I've got an event, I've got people, can we work together? So the community was really great about fostering that partnership. And I'm super grateful that we can work together by just bridging that gap.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That sounds like a very interesting process of, working with others and how you mentioned, bridging that gap. So thank you so much for that response again. And we do have another question from my fellow ambassador, Joanna.
Hello. Also, like Utman mentioned, I would love to add that I really appreciated your personal knowledge on all of these experiences, because sometimes numbers don't really illustrate everything in its full capacity. So hearing your experiences and the work that you've done really stood out to me. So thank you. I do have a question just out of curiosity. Historically, incarcerated and previously incarcerated folks are not eligible for the California Pell Grant, that free college money. The Department of Education says that by 2023, it should be undone. What else do you think, the Department of Education can do in order to help out, these folks that were missing out on the Pell Grant for so long?
I'm not fully aware like educational stuff. However, I'm glad to hear that they will be offering. But what we really have seen again is other organizations really supporting formerly incarcerated people. So whether it's philanthropists or fundraising or creating a little nest egg, right? So I'm glad to see that our hard work with going into the Capitol and sharing our struggles and humanizing and saying that we know that education does get you out of poverty, right? I mean, this is why I'm investing in myself with education. It did so much for me. It gave me confidence. It gave me a voice. It gave me so much. And so I'm finally happy to see that decision makers are coming around to the idea that these folks do deserve a second chance. And so 2023 can't come quick enough.
I agree. And especially because the Pell Grant covers so much of tuition, at least for a lot of UC students. So imagine what a Pell Grant could do for these folks as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. And the Pell Grant helped me, right? And what's great about it, and I tell other people, is in turn, we pay it forward. So I'm looking forward to helping my community so I can continue to pay it forward because my community had my back. Thank you for investing in me, community.
Yeah, so it's interesting to see what will happen in the year 2023. I'm pretty sure we're going to see a lot of activism, a lot going on that year. So I'm also very excited to see that. So next, we do have another question from an audience member. Alfredo Camacho asked, there were many institutional barriers you mentioned. Are there any barriers that are not blatant or formalized? For example, or prejudice, etc. And what can we do either through policy or system changes?
So I really brought up barriers that we see frequently and ongoing, right? But there's just so many other, for example, licensing. So the one member at All of Us or None, formerly incarcerated, got out, started to invest in their education, became a lawyer, or tried to become, went to law school, but could not be a lawyer. They had to actually get a pardon from the governor. And so we're seeing that those kinds of barriers hold people back. They're rising above, right? They're overcoming those institutional barriers or societal barriers, but they're still being held back. We see that oftentimes with licensing. So a formerly incarcerated person can't even be a barber or a cosmetologist or be an exterminator. Because those all take state licensing. And unfortunately, those are some barriers of the state licensing. Just small, they can't be a realtor. Sometimes they can't even be a volunteer at their children's school because of that. And that's why I was really emphasizing automatic expungement. We could be here all day talking about the 4,800 collateral consequences. But instead, what I'm going to do is champion these policy changes. And so I appreciate Alfredo's question in regards to that.
Yes, and thank you for educating us on that topic about the licensing. For me, it's very shocking to know that an incarcerated individual can't even be a barber or any position that needs a license. So thank you for that, Kristelda.
Yeah.
So now we're going to go ahead and move on to another question from my fellow ambassador, Kevin.
Thank you, Yoli, and thank you, Creiselda, for your presentation. I just want to echo what everyone's been saying. I think it was not only interesting to hear the statistics and the facts, but also your personal experiences. I think that really grounds the issue and really makes it relatable. My question,
can I cut in real quick? I'm so glad that you guys are saying that. Oftentimes when I would go to council meetings, board of supervisor meetings, or even the state capitol, nobody had that lived experience. No one had that work experience. And so I thought it's so vital for us to be in those spaces, right? And so that just gives me even more passion to go out there. So again, thank you for acknowledging that. It's super important that someone like myself is in those spaces. Sorry, Kevin, go for it.
No worries. I think it's really important to emphasize. I think in a lot of ways, it's one of the most important parts of the topic and of the issue. My question is also about formerly incarcerated individuals. it's a very large question. I was wondering what your thoughts are on it. You know, a lot of the policies that were in place that prevent these people from continuing their lives are policies that are based on older ideas. Do you think that modern and current societal changes, changes that have taken place over the last decade, do you think they've had an impact on people changing their minds? The idea that just because you were incarcerated in the past doesn't mean that your life has to end, that you still deserve to have opportunities. So the first part of the question is, do you think that these new ideas have affected it? And also, do you think that enough has been done based on these societal developments? There's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of talk about how these policies are bad, but as we've been talking, there hasn't really been enough policy changes. And so I know it's a very broad question, but what are your thoughts on these societal dynamics and how things have developed over the past 20, 30, 40 years?
Kevin, I got a lot of thoughts on that. Unfortunately, yes, we are still using a 400-year-old Victorian prison model. Okay, I understand tough love, but that doesn't always work. You're going to get more honeys with bee than vinegar. And so I have seen some policy changes. For example, in 2018, we did ban the box, which on the employment application, there would be a box that says, check if you're a felon. Okay, so we banned that in California. But I heard still after 2018 that that box was still visible on applications and employers were still asking. So there's this huge gap of communication between like Sacramento and really down to the employers, or maybe Sacramento to the county, right? So things take time to shift, right? Not only does policy and it trickle down, including local policies that changed in Riverside County. And we're like, okay, cool. We know that this policy has been inducted and it's changed and is there an ordinance and we shouldn't have this problem. However, again, we saw people still having barriers with like housing authority, Riverside County Housing Authority. And so we know that unfortunately, the top is not talking to the bottom, right? It's not trickling down that communication. And so that's a huge barrier. Like, how do we actually systematically change that? Okay. So as far as society, what I'm learning in school and my public policy program is there's a lot of theories. My background is sociology as well. I constantly love observing human behavior and why we do the wacky things we do. Now I have a really good idea. And so what I'm getting at is it takes time to shift those cultures, right? And so we see things like the racial threat theory, right? Like at first it's a curvilinear at first, like who's this person in my neighborhood? I don't know who they are. And then after a while, they're like, oh, they're kind of cool. Not a big deal, right? But we see that some people are taking it to the extreme that they create policies to actually to push them out of their neighborhoods or whatnot. And so they're like hyper vigilant still here. But again, as they get to know their person or their neighbors are like, oh, they're pretty cool, actually. Oh, they're sweet or kind, or they're a doctor, or they just want to, observe birds in a park and we don't need to call the cops or anything like that. So we just really need to also do cultural literacy, get to know each other, right? Why do they dress that way? Why do they cook that way? Why do they talk that way? Why do they party that way? Why do they celebrate that way? It would be so beautiful if we just embrace each other, but we're so self-segregated and isolated. It's just really harming us, even more so during COVID. And I really fear for that because, when you're isolated, your mental health goes down and it's very dangerous. And so, yeah, but we'll get there, Kevin. We will.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I really like that emphasis on cultural literacy, getting to know one another and embracing one another. I feel like that's definitely something that, as you mentioned, needs to be worked on within our community. So I really appreciate that emphasis.
Sure.
Next, we're going to go ahead and go with my fellow ambassador, Claudia.
Hi, Creiselda. Thank you so much again. And I know it sounds like an echo, but I really do appreciate the work that you're doing. I feel as though this is a demographic that often gets forgotten in policy or in society itself. Yeah. So it's really important to have advocates such as yourself to really speak on this, like for this population. And I know that after listening to your presentation, a lot of the work that you do seems to be after these persons have left incarceration. And I know that you've already spoken to increasing wage while they're incarcerated, but is there anything else that can be done to support these persons while they're incarcerated to make that that transition into life afterwards easier?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Claudia. In fact, as a reminder, we really focus on formerly incarcerated because one of my slides said 8 million people, 8 million Californians, okay? 8 million Californians have a past conviction that can still haunt them to this day. And guess what? Those 8 million people have family. So we're not only continuing to punish those 8 million Californians, we're punishing their family. And I was one of those family members. So I know what it was like to be told what to do, where to live, how much money we can have and whatnot, right? And so there is a lot of work we still can do with in-reach. So in-reach meaning reaching out to them incarcerated, right? And that's what we do at All of Us or None. We find out, especially during COVID, like, how are you guys being treated? Do you guys have access to vaccine? Do you have access to masks? Do you have access to nurses and whatnot? And so we want to know how their health is. Oftentimes they're eating moldy food or something that looks like food, and they're coming out with terrible, terrible health. So we really try to communicate with Board of Supervisors, since they are the ones who control our budget locally, with the sheriffs, and try to see like how can we actually assist, right? Or advocate for family members, because we don't want them going in ill and coming out even worse. And so I mentioned earlier institutional trauma, right? So being incarcerated causes trauma, and that, you know, they come out with major PTSD, institutionalized, and it's hard to transition them back. So there's just so many layers, Claudia, that we really have to address. And who's the right person to do it but the family members and or formerly incarcerated people?
Yes, thank you so much for, emphasizing again the family. I know you talked a little bit about how many are incarcerated and mental health, and then they come out worse. So I think that's definitely something that we should all be advocating, going to our city council, as you mentioned, to this board of supervisors. So I really appreciate you, putting that emphasis on going out and reaching out to our community and our elected officials.
For sure.
So next, we do have a question from one of our audience members, Amari. Amari asks, as someone who is interested in prison reform and advocating the formerly incarcerated people, what can I do to get involved as someone who does not have that lived experience or even secondhand experience?
Yes, as I mentioned on my last slide, is joining a organization. We're learning, and I've learned from my experience, that volunteering opens so many amazing doors. Volunteering at All of Us or None gave me an opportunity to be a community organizer. I had no experience. I didn't know what the heck I was doing, but I knew that my story could take me very far, and it really has, right? People accepted me. People saw the struggles. But if you don't have that lived experience, everything that I'm saying, I know that people also struggle with that, who are not formally incarcerated. Mental health, childhood trauma, also working poor, not having enough money to be with your upward mobility. And so really investing and whether your time or money in local organizations is super, super needed. Grassroots, we're out there, we are knocking, we are sweating, we are really just putting the work in there. And so I would say just starting with volunteering or following an organization, if you can't afford your time, like I was too poor, so I volunteered with my time. But now I'm so busy that I'm gonna, give them a little money on Giving Tuesday or during their fundraising or whatnot, right? So I highly suggest that petitions help tremendously. Support letter helps tremendously. So there are different tools to continue to help, and really also not being so passive in the community. For example, I appreciate and respect that you guys are calling the population formerly incarcerated, because we don't want to say, oh, that felon. Because no one wants to be called something that was enacted on them, right? Oh, here's Debbie who's got schizophrenia, or Larry who has diabetes. No, this is, oh, Larry the diabetic. They don't say, Jose the felon. No. So just kind of following suit and being respectful of what system impacted people wish to that the society can help. And I think that would actually go back to Kevin's question, is that's how we start shifting society, right? Shifting how we address people, how we look at people, and not watching movies and getting freaked out by certain people. So hope that helps, Laurie.
Yeah, and I think it's really critical, the effort that you put with volunteering at a nonprofit organization really goes a really long way. And then, those formerly incarcerated are going to be like, these people are with me and resonate with us, especially considering that we don't have that lived experience like yourself, which is super amazing. So now we have another question from another fellow ambassador, Rayon.
Thank you so much, Yoli. And thank you, Kristelda, for speaking with us today. As a first-year public policy student, I've been extremely interested in over-incarceration. And alongside with over-incarceration, obviously comes extremely high recidivism rates. So can you tell me a little bit just about how the difficulties of having conviction on your record might lead to a higher recidivism rate and lead people back to crime?
So as I mentioned throughout my presentation is, again, if you don't have that stable stability, that stable housing or stable income, you're going to be homeless. And we have a high homeless rate for formerly incarcerated people. And when you're out there, unfortunately, you're going to get caught up in something you don't even want to, right? And it's so hard to not get caught up because sometimes we revert back to places that are our previous communities, right? Because they know you, they're going to embrace you. But sometimes we're going back to the lion's den and we shouldn't. But that's because we don't have nowhere else to go. And then I also saw often is they're not making it to their parole or probation check-ins, right? Which is like super far away. They have to take like 3 buses. They don't have a bus pass, or they have one that just takes them there. And they can't come back. So they're walking home, they get profiled, they get pulled over. They may see that they have a, outstanding something warrant, or it's just so many things, unfortunately, that can really get them caught up. And so I keep emphasizing with law enforcement, can you please stop racially profiling? Like, let us do our thing, right? Don't over police our communities. Don't pull us over for no reason. It's just, yeah. So unfortunately, the recidivism rate does get high when you're homeless, because you're homeless, and that's sometimes a crime is to be homeless. Like, my bad that I can't work my way up. But there's a lot of things, including 4,800 collateral consequences against these folks. And so again, we really need to create and foster opportunities to give them a hand up, right? So we're working on it.
Yes, fostering those connections, fostering those opportunities for everyone is very important. So thank you so much, Creiselda, for sharing that with us. So I do have one last question, and this is coming from myself. And I just wanted to ask if you could give one piece of advice to, someone who is system impacted, ready to start their career. You mentioned you started college at 30 years old, which is amazing. You look amazing, by the way. What would be one piece of advice that you would give them so that they feel supportive that they can do this?
For sure. If Kristelda can do it, y'all can do it too. I had everything against me, right? Being formerly incarcerated, being on social services, well, my parents, that is, just really kind of being at the mercy of government. And they had already what my life was going to be like, right? I was going to probably be a single parent, a high school dropout, no education, and probably incarcerated myself. But that really fueled me. It fueled me to say, you know what, I'm going to let those haters know that they're not going to control my life. They're not going to predict my life. They're not going to keep me down. And even though I was a high school dropout, and even though I started my GED at 25 and started school at 30, I am now working on my master's, okay? It is possible. It is doable. It is a beautiful thing. It really lifted my spirits, my confidence to really advocate for other people and myself. And so again, if you're angry because you have a lack of coping skills, or rightfully so perhaps, use that energy for good. to create change. And I always love two quotes. One is, you be the change in the community you want to see. And I'm on it now, y'all. And lastly, as my old boss would say, is we are too valuable to be written off, to be forgotten about. And so I really use those two models in my head to just keep moving forward and encouraging and inspiring others.
Wow, thank you, Creiselda. Can I say you're just such an amazing, resilient individual? And I know if you can do it, anyone can do it. Now, before we wrap up, we do have a comment from Greg Sanchez, an audience member. Greg Sanchez says, I have no questions, but Creiselda, on behalf of underground scholars, thank you for the work you're doing. This morning, I met with SPP Dean Delalkar, Associate Dean Schwabi, and Dr. Sharon Oslin and Dr. Justine Ross to discuss issues concerning the Presley Center and underground scholars. There's going to be deep conversations coming up in spring between SPP and USI. We are so thrilled to have your support.
That is amazing. I love. This is why UCR, just keep investing in your students, right? We are here for a reason. We are mission driven. We are intentful. We are mindful. Let us foster. This is beautiful. Oh, awesome. Good to hear.
We certainly are. We are a good representation of all our students. So Creiselda, this is the end of our allotted time for questions and comments. So thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you again for this time and opportunity. I'm so excited. Can't wait to be out in the field where we can make some change.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Our deepest gratitude to Creiselda for taking time out of her very busy schedule to join us today as part of our Student Spotlight series. Thank you so much again for your time and work. And for everyone online, you can learn more about other events hosted by the UCR School of Public Policy like these by visiting our website, spp.ucr.edu. Additionally, you can learn about our Master of Public Policy program, as well as our new combined BA MPP program. Thank you all for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you at a future SPP event soon. Until then, goodbye.